I probably missed my introduction. I was simply giving some thoughts about the situation in the Middle East. I spent a few months teaching last year at the Canon Institute for the Philosophy of Science in Tel Aviv, so I have very fond memories of all the colleagues there and the students. And also I have a prospective PhD student in Nablus who want to study a bioethnographic study of trauma in Palestine, and she's stuck there, and Australia's rejected her visa, so it's a very sad situation. And since my talk is very much about barriers to knowledge and the global south, global north divide, I think this shows very well our very limited power as scholars, that sometimes is, we live somehow in bubbles, in academic bubbles or mirrors, but then when the state power comes and they basically say, no, we don't give the visa to this person, it's not a genuine request for studying. Unfortunately, there is very little you feel you can do. With this caveat and this premise, I'm going to present on this talk of decolonizing biology. As you can see, there is a question mark, because I want to keep open the possibility that this is a meaningful question. I know in conversation these days with Francisco, he has told me about decolonial intoxication. So, I also am aware that this is becoming a big bandwagon. It's not my point to be in any bandwagon. I've been doing work on the politics of biology for a few years now, and what led me honestly to this conversation here is the combined effect of spending 5 years in Australia, so dealing with a country that has a very peculiar temporality. It's a country that has begun 200 and something years ago, but at the same time has begun, 60,000 more years ago. So this is a very interesting broken narrative. And the other thing is that I genuinely recognize that my book, Political Biology, which is on the politics of biology, is seriously wanting on this side of decolonial debates. I will say in a couple of ways why I wouldn't write a book like that now. So for me, this decolonial story is a way of self-reflecting on my own work and trying to do a better work. And I hope the same is for people working in the life sciences. I think the hope should be to do a better biology. And so that's the spirit with which I deal with this topic. I mean, I will skip all this presentation. This is, as you know, in Australia, we would do in this context an acknowledgement to the country, so to the people who own and inhabited land before the settlers came. So I left that logo as a memory. And this drawing here, I think it's very powerful. We'll come to this drawing during the course of my talk. But this is a representation of drawing of Thomas Huxley. Thomas Huxley is one of the key figures, although mostly a popularizing figure, but one of the key figures of Darwinian evolution. He was famous, was called Darwin's bulldog for his very vocal defense of Darwinism. He's also the grandfather of Julian Huxley, who is, among various things, the founder of UNESCO and the first post-war president of the British Eugenics Society. So the Huxleys, as the book recently written by Alison Bashford, The Story of the Family, is very much the story of evolution. And this is a Huxley encounter in Rockingham Bay, which is a beautiful beach in Queensland, so in northeast Australia, of an indigenous person. And this, I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into this drawing, but it's very significant, this double feeling of curiosity and suspicion, of distance and at the same time attraction. The argument I want to make in the first part of my talk is that it is a bit overlooked how the notion of indigenous people, possibly understood as a doomed race, a race that was soon to disappear from the earth, had in fact shaped some of the theoretical investigation about natural selection and survival of the fittest. So I want to sort of reintroduce the importance of aboriginality within the construction of 19th century evolutionary theory. Then I will move quickly to the 20th century just to say a few things about why I would write a different political biology today about the 20th century. And then I will move more practically to some of the research projects we have carried out in Australia on indigenous epigenetics and on epigenetics and Ayurveda in India. To give a sense of what kind of practices of hybridization we can realize in this area of decolonizing biology, or anyway contributing to this debate. And of course, the very beginning of any talk in this area should be positionality, so tell who am I, right? So I'm a non-indigenous scholar, of course, with roots in Southern European languages and the Mediterranean area. I don't have a PhD from the Anglosphere, but from Southern Italy, and I've been working as an academic expat for 2 decades in English-speaking countries and other Northern European countries. And this has been an experience that has enabled me to be both insider and outsider with regards to debates on decolonization, language, and power. And moreover, as an Italian, that's what the slide is about, I belong to a country that has been at the same time in different phases of history violent genocidal colonizer, for instance, in East Africa or in Libya, and a colonized nation, a moral ambiguity that somehow disrupts clear binaries of oppressor and oppressed of typical settler colonial experiences, where it's very clear who is on the side of power, who is the victim. So this is to say there is a complexity often in this debate that escapes somehow the terms of the debate. But let me go now to the decolonizing story very briefly, so you might know this already pretty well. Since the appearance in 2014, 2015 of student-led movements such as Rhodes Must Fall, that's Cecil Rhodes' statue at the University of Cape Town, that was sort of the beginning of the movement. And more broadly, since the rising society of the Black Lives Matter movement, we have witnessed growing calls to decolonize scientific knowledge, curriculums, and practices, defined as the intelligent, calculated, and active resistance to the forces of colonialism that perpetuate the subjugation and or exploitation of our minds, bodies, and lands, and whose ultimate purpose is overturning the colonial structure and realizing indigenous liberation. Decolonization has pushed many of us non-indigenous scholars to see more clearly and profoundly, like in a mirror, the Eurocentric and imperial structures of many of the concepts, frameworks, and tropes developed by metropolitan social sciences in the last 15 decades. Before I move ahead, I want just to say a couple of things more. So one thing, I don't know how much you are interested in this debate or are into this debate, but postcolonial and decolonial are not the same thing. It's a bit of a contentious topic. I wouldn't overdo the problem in the sense it's a bit an academic quibble, so to speak, but there are differences. I would summarize these differences saying that the post-colonial experience was mostly about producing an hybridized language that, in a sense, would go beyond the binary of colonized and colonizers. Also, I think the post-colonial experience, for instance, in the case of Edouard Said, is much more linked to traditional notions of humanism and resistance. Whereas I think the decolonial enterprise is a bit more, it's way more skeptical about the value of humanism. Rather than hybridity, I think the emphasis is more on the linking or deconnection. Somehow it's also recovering a sort of original epistemology of the disenfranchised, there is also a geographical divide in the sense that most of post-colonial studies were focusing on the Middle East and the Indian area, whereas a substantial contribution of decoloniality comes from Latin America, and of course Walter Mignolo is the most known representative alongside people like Enrique Dussel, etc. But this is to say, I don't want to make this, I don't think it's easy. Just to say, the two words are not the same, the debate is complex and is happening right now. Another thing I wanted to say, we don't have time for that. Another thing I wanted to say is that decolonizing is not just an academic debate about writing papers or removing statues of imperialists from university campuses. There is possibly even a longer tradition in architecture, in heritage studies, about, I showed something about architecture in the next slide, but what is important, I think, about heritage studies for me, for what I'm going to tell about epigenetics and colonial trauma, is this notion of inscription. So coloniality exists as a form of deep inscription. This is an heritage scholar commenting on decoloniality. So coloniality exists, as a form of deep inscription in monuments, landscapes, in lives and in bodies of ideas and practices. So this notion of bodies as archives is very, very important also in epigenetics. So I can see here a continuity with some of the work done by people in the decolonizing heritage tradition. So for instance, this is a citation from a Narunga woman from South Australia, who is also a research professor at Flinders University in South Australia, Natalie Harkin. Our bodies too are archives where memories, stories, and lived experiences are stored, etched and anchored in our bloodlines. This is a very powerful notion in indigenous culture, tradition, indigenous healing. But beside indigenous Australia, I've seen this kind of embedding into genealogical stories as a therapeutic way in many different cultural experiences. Yes, this is something we recently saw at the Biennale in Venice, so it's still on. This is a group that was born a few years ago in Palestine. It is based on an attempt to decolonize settlements and spaces that have been abandoned, like a military fortress in the south of Israel. And they have these ideas. I mentioned these ideas because it might be helpful theoretically for what I'm trying to do with biology. They speak of unhoming as a way to turn the suburban single-family housing into a collective space. They speak of deactivation of the settlement logic of separation and the emergence of new forms of life in common. They speak of ungrounding to envisage the acceleration of the decay of the existing road and ground surfaces in the settlement. So this is also something which is not strictly academic, but I think it's a significant experience to take inspiration from. And of course, more importantly, again, there is this tendency in the academia to have a very short view of history, and the decolonizing history is, of course, way longer than the experience I just described. It has to do, of course, with the major decolonial trend in post-World War II, but also with other movements like the Negritude movement, the MSSA, Repulse and Go, the Tricontinental. This is an interesting book that just came out, From the Tricontinental to the Global South, about transnational solidarity of movements based in Cuba, Havana. But there is also a tradition of black scholarship about the French Revolution, for instance, Hegel and the Haitian Revolution. So, I mean, there is all a history that probably is not well captured by the trend I have described recently. And before moving on, I also want to discuss something which I found interesting. This is something I have to do in a more structured way, so take this now with a grain of salt. But I found very interesting, doing a very quick search on Google Gram, that the word decolonization is obviously heavily on the rise when it comes to the English language. But this is not the same for other languages. So, for instance, in French, for the word décolonisation, the trend is what you would expect, picking up in the 60s and the 70s and being nearly absent today. The other one must be the verb décoloniser, I think. And Spanish, similarly, there is a trend like that with decolonizar and decolonización, descolonizar. That's interesting. We can have questions. Is it like that because people are now all publishing in English their stuff, because this would be reflect only, or is it a trend that reflects that decolonizing story is very much an Anglo-American, Australian, Canadian kind of story? I mean, that's a question that is open. Italian and German follows the same path. So decolonizzare in Italian also had a peak in the 60s, the 70s. It goes down. The same is for the German. Dekolonisierung, I did also the search, Entkolonisierung. How do you say? Not to be vulnerable of criticism, but this is another strange story, that the Portuguese version instead is way on the rise. So again, I don't have an answer here. I want to do some deeper research behind that. My feeling is that there is very much I would say probably an academic bubble in the Anglosphere, in the academic Anglosphere, which is not followed up both by movements in society and by other academic trends. But it can be a more complicated story than this, as the Portuguese example shows. Something on which instead there is not much dispute is the rise of the term Global South or Sur Global, which is definitely an expression that has been used heavily. And this is English on the left and Spanish on the right. There is a very good study, which, if you are interested, it's called Global South as a meta-category. It's a sort of critical analysis of how the term Global South is used. And of course, the term is in a booming growth. It has, they correctly point out the use of cardinal geographic terms to describe world differences is not new, and that Global South has replaced somehow words like Third World or developing countries or whatever. But it's used now very hugely in World Bank documents. For instance, United Nations Finance Center for South-South Cooperation is another example. So the pro and the con of using this term, the pro, I think, is definitely that it gives an effects in visibility to some of the problems. It sheds light on some of the issues we want to discuss. The cons are many as well. One is obviously creating a false homogeneity, which is somehow not helpful in bringing together too many different stories and situations. The other part of the story is also that this big growth in the analysis of Global South has not been followed by a significant growth in the analysis of the Global North. So the Global North remains a bit like the observer that is not under the spotlight, right? Whereas it's the Global South as an object that takes very much the focus. But this is a debate which is interesting to have. Now let's move to global health, biomedicine, and then we'll return to biology. So the decolonizing trend and how the hard sciences and medicine and STEM disciplines are located in this. Also, they have not been spurred by this heightened process of self-scrutiny, in the words of Leon Musavi, founder of the Decolonial Critique Global Network. This self-reflective process focuses on notions such as epistemic injustice to describe the distinctive cognitive forms of injustice, lack of credibility, respect, authority, which occurs in global science to subjects of knowledge that are currently marginalized by the accredited pyramid of Northern European, US, Australian networks of epistemic power. For instance, Nigerian and Sydney-based health researcher Sei Abimbola has described what he calls a problem of gaze at the heart of academic global health. Recent bibliometric analysis, this is one that is a source in his article, confirm patterns that are largely explained by entrenched power asymmetries in global health partnerships between researchers in high-income countries, often the source of funds and agenda, those in middle income, and especially low-income countries where the research is often conducted. And of course, the figure is more complex than that, but just to give a sense of what the debate has been in this area. This is an interesting data. In global health studies, 75% of all the global scientific production comes from the four big Anglo countries: United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. And the very first country that comes from the global south, Paco, is Brazil, at position number 14. I don't know if it is dependent you were there at the time. Might be the case. But Brazil is certainly an exception in this kind of trend. I can see that Spain ranks 10th. This is, though, a scoping review that I think it ended in 2015. So this data may be slightly different today. Anyway, we are doing a similar thing. I want to introduce another issue just tangentially. We are doing a similar scoping review, but just for science and technology studies. This is still to be published, but these are some of the data. And this is my colleague, Dr. Ayuba Isaka, Deakin University, who is the guy who understands all this quantitative part of the story. And this is a case where we don't just see a domination from some very obvious global north centers, but the most shocking thing of the history of STS is the monolingualism. The monolingualism. So we have tried an analysis of the 300 most cited articles in the whole history of STS. And not only there is no one that is not in English, but also the sources of these articles are largely Anglo-American sources with very few exceptions. French authors like Bruno Latour translated into English or even in original, but nonetheless. So this kind of famously Michael Gordon, historian at the University of Chicago, has published a book on, it's called Babel language, something like that. And he says science is the most monolingual community ever existed in the world. And this wasn't the case until 1920s, 1930s. There were at least 3 languages competing in these disciplines like chemistry or physics. But regardless, social studies of science was born in an attempt to pluralize ontologies and epistemologies, and this doesn't seem very much the case, at least from the kind of production we have mapped. But this article is still to come out, so there is time to discuss this. The point I want to make now, before going to the history of biology very briefly, is that to ask the question that, for instance, has been asked in this article in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. I want also to signal that all these articles by Abimbola or this one in Nature, Ecology and Evolution are now being published in really top leading international journals. So it's no longer a matter of alternative kind of stuff. So this is now made as a point of reflection in the whole scientific community in this case. So this is a case of the lack of cultural diversity in STEM fields in the United States. So this article in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, they say from 2014 to 2018, only 0.2% of US PhD graduates in ecology and evolutionary biology were American Indian or Alaska Native, and 1% were black. Furthermore, black scientists make up just 0.7% of biology faculty members at large public universities. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, only 0.6% of university professors were black in the STEM disciplines. In many countries, representations of indigenous groups is low in STEM fields. In Australia, in 2015, indigenous student enrollment in STEM programs was fewer than 1,000 individuals, far lower than any other field of study. So, as a sort of amateur historian, I wanted to ask the question if this is just a reflection of structural imbalances of power in society, or it has to do with some baggage, so to speak, of biology as a discipline and the history of biology. And again, I don't have an answer, but I would like to give a very quick survey of how much the history of biology is deeply ingrained into imperial infrastructure of knowledge. These are well-known things for historians, but it's worth briefly repeating that. So let me read quickly, and you'll have some of the books I've used here. So certainly the history of biology is very difficult to disentangle from its imperial infrastructures of knowledge. The entanglement of colonial expeditions and the making of sciences like botany, ecology, evolution is a too well-known story to be repeated here in details. Just a few highlights will suffice. So historians like Londa Schibinger have shown, for instance, how botany, expertise in bioprospecting, plant identification, transport and acclimatization worked hand in hand with the European colonial expansion. European ecologists benefited from the help of naval and military personnel, colonial administrators and diplomats, medical officers who all gave colonial access to land for expeditions, and the establishment of field stations that helped and continue to help form foundational theories in ecology and evolution. She goes into the details of this. I think we can, I think we got the major point, how botany gardens represented the imperial network of power, and how all the history of taxonomy is very much influenced by this kind of metropole colonies as a source of information and metropole as organizing colonial information. Historians like, speaking of botanical nomenclature, historians like Canizares Esquerra for Latin America has compared this to a military occupation of names, as important as the one on land. The question that Schibinger and other historians have asked is whether by constructing biology through these imperial lenses and infrastructures of travels, exploitation and discoveries, we might have limited the possibility and chances of multiple epistemologies and taxonomies about other biologies or botanies or biogeographies that have unfortunately never appeared. This is another thing I would like to mention before moving to the 19th century. Speaking of cancel culture, this is a story that is very well known in India. How, for instance, speaking of erasure of knowledge, a British pharmacopoeia started very much by building on existing very well widespread Indian knowledge, and in the course of the time, this is a story that has been told by many medical historians in India, replaced all the kind of Indian traditional drugs and recipes for drugs, to the point that traditional drugs were prohibited to be produced in India because they would lack some of the requested ingredients or protocols, and so this developed a dependence in India itself to then buy from the metropole the kind of drugs that were already existing in India. But the other story I would like to mention is that this process is not to be seen as a monolithic process either. It is actually, this is what really interests me. In the second part I will describe this, that the encounter between the medical expert from England and the medical expert from India until a certain age, let's say until when humoralism was still a dominant view of the body in Europe, was of course a sort of peer-to-peer encounter, because the kind of medicine that in the 1700 or early 1800 British doctors would find in India was incredibly resonant with the kind of Hippocratic medicine they would practice in England as well. So based on the importance of airs, waters, places, etc. So this also shows a story where it is only after a certain there is a hardening of this divide between medical expertise from the metropole and medical expertise at the local level, which gets wider and wider after, let's say, the invention of modern biomedicine, modern medicine first, and of course biomedicine later. Something is catching up on this, and this is why I want to tell the story of epigenetics. But this is to give some sort of background context about this story. Now let's move to the 19th century, of course, and obviously the figure of Darwin is the major figure we want to discuss. And the story remains as problematic as it could be. The greatest scientific discoveries of the time, such as Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, were also underpinned by imperial infrastructures of knowledge and commercial and military exchange. As Janet Brown reminds us, the same Beagle voyage under the command of Robert Fitzroy was a colonial exercise to ascertain the commercial and strategic potential of the east coast of South America in the light of the Argentine states having been released in 1824 from their commitment to trade only with Spain and Portugal. One of Fitzroy's duties was to reclaim the Falkland Islands from Argentina, literally showing the British flag. Another was to extract a government fine from the Queen of Tahiti. His route around was in essence determined by geopolitical and national rather than by any strictly scientific question. This is pretty obvious to say, but it's important to remind the context. And although the politics of Darwinism is a very complex matter, and I don't buy easy determinism between Darwinism and social Darwinism is itself a very contested category. Anyway, it's a complex matter. And one doesn't need to be reminded how historians such as Desmond and Moore have linked Darwin's scientific position on the common descent of humankind to his moral passion for anti-slavery. It is unquestionable, however, that Darwin's description of the way of living of indigenous population during his Beagle voyage are highly problematic for our standards. To me, this is not just a matter of being highly problematic. It's also a matter of what sort of taken for granted assumption were the tacit background upon which his view of competition among races, he meant races not just in the human sense, in the sense of any kind of animal or life group. I want to mention a few things here. Probably I would start from what something is often forgotten, that the Beagle voyage occurred with three indigenous people who were kidnapped in a previous voyage by Robert Fitzroy. Originally, he did kidnap these two young men and a young woman, Fueja, or in his original name, Yokshru, a native girl from the Alakaluf, or Kanoi people from the western part of Tierra del Fuego. These people were kidnapped, and of course, this might not have the same resonance here in Catalonia, but when you say something like that in Australia with the story of the stolen generation, so the people of mixed ancestry that were literally kidnapped by the government and resettled in families, this sounds like a very bad analogy. Anyway, these people were kidnapped in a first trip by Fitzroy and then educated, civilized in the British way for a few years, and then took back to, it was a sort of, if you want, biosocial something experiment of sort, taken back on the Beagle to the Tierra del Fuego, where, for instance, Fueja had a very unpleasant experience because her family disowned her. So when she returned, but it's interesting that Darwin had this trip together with these three indigenous people. Anyway, his comments on indigenous populations are well known for being very harsh. He describes the people of the Tierra del Fuego as miserable creatures, stunted in their growth, their hideous faces bedaubed with white paint and quite naked, their red skins filthy and greasy, their hair entangled, their voices discordant, their gesticulation violent and without any dignity. Their skill, like the instinct of animals, is not improved by experience. Unlike the instinct of animals. The canon, their most ingenious work, poor as it may be, we know has remained the same for 300 years. Although essentially the same creature, how little must the mind of one of these beings resemble that of an educated man? What a scale of improvement is comprehended between the faculties of a Fuegian savage and the Sir Isaac Newton. And this is a very interesting letter. Again, this is not to blame Darwin, but it's about to give some of the cultural context, which I think I'm understanding more living in a settler colony as Australia is. This is Darwin is 22, so we're not blaming anyone. Anyone has written strange things at 22, but he's basically writing a letter to a friend of his before boarding for the Beagle, and he's basically saying that it is to prepare the journey. Such capital fun ordering things. Today I order a rifle and 2 pair of pistols. For sure, we shall have plenty of fighting with those damned cannibals. It would be something to shoot the king of the cannibal island. So this view of sort of basic situation of conflict among races, I think it's pretty important in the way theory of evolution then has been structured. This is another story. This is a passage from much later, from The Descent of Man. So this is like 40 years after this letter, where again he goes back to the Australian Aboriginal people to make this comparison, which is pretty shocking because it's a comparison that, of course, reflects something about the notion of people's capacity to improve and malleability, which was a big part of the debate about evolution of social customs at the time. So he says, no one supposes that one of the lower animals reflects when he comes or whether he goes, what is death and what is life and so forth. But can we feel sure that an old dog with an excellent memory and some power of imagination, as shown by his dreams, never reflects on his past pleasures in the chase? So he's trying to expand consciousness to higher animals, so to speak. And this would be a form of self-consciousness. On the other hand, again, to complicate the divide between human and animal, he introduces the Australian savage and says, how little can the hard-worked wife of a degraded Australian savage, who uses hardly any abstract words and cannot count above 4, exert her self-consciousness or reflect on the nature of her own existence. Again, this is not so much a racist abuse, it's more an attempt to show that there is a sort of gray area in the history of consciousness where maybe a dog has a better and more evolved consciousness than indigenous woman. This is important because a similar story happens with Thomas Henry Huxley. Huxley's story, I'm not going into this now for too long because I want to discuss more practical things about some of the research projects I've been carrying out. But very quickly, he also did this important discovery journey through Guinea and then Australia. He did this on a boat and was employed by the British to fight the first opium war against China. So this is to say, again, the interconnection between political power and biological expertise. What is interesting about Huxley is that in his most famous book and most famous manifesto for Darwinian evolution in the 19th century, he does this. He was a very skillful drawer. He would be an excellent, had an excellent capacity to draw skulls. He would receive skulls from all over the world to make comparison, etc. And again, in order to show the animality, the root of humans into nature, so into the animal kingdom, he does this succession of different primates, and monkeys and primates, comes to gorilla, and then in order to find sort of lowest point of humanity that can be connected to the animal kingdom, again, it's the Australian school that is resurrected here. And again, this shows that the story of the discovery of these indigenous Australians by this great naturalist of the 19th century was just more than a matter of customary sort of difference or etiquette that they didn't feel comfortable with. There was something, I think, structural, and Malthus would be another very good example on the way in which indigenous life as a wasted life, a life where there is no saving, there is no projection toward the future, is very part of the notion of what in nature can go wrongly without social checks. So I'm trying to say, although this would require more structure, that there is a sort of intimacy of the indigenous question within evolutionary theory in the 19th century in a way that probably has not been recognized enough. Okay, we don't have time to discuss Julian Huxley here, but I just wanted to say two quick things before going to the project. So exactly, when I say I would write political biology in a different way, I want to give two examples. So one is this. I made a very good research about race plasticity and debates on race plasticity and migration, especially in the United States. The role of Franz Boas, of course, is very well known. But this is one author, Antenor Firmin, who, of course, he didn't have the ethnographic capacity of Boas, but still, although it's mostly a speculative book, wrote this response to infamous book by the Comte de Gobineau on l'inégalité des races humaines. He wrote this response, which is on the equality of human races. And this an important contribution to the history of developmental plasticity that I missed completely. And it's an author that luckily now has been translated into English, so it's also being studied and discussed in biological anthropology department in some biological anthropology department in the United States. And another thing, where, for instance, I gave lots of importance to the class dimension of eugenics, I think there was a very specific racial connotation in several of the eugenics experiments and in general medical experimentation. I don't want to go into this now because it would be a bit of a distraction for what I want to say. But this is to say that I think decolonizing is helpful in this sense, also for non-indigenous scholars like myself to do a better scholarship. Okay, let's move quickly. How long do we have more? Yeah, I don't want to speak too much, just give you some inputs about what I've been doing in Australia with my group and lots of excellent colleagues, junior and senior, about this understanding of biology, epigenetics in particular in the global south, and possible hybridization between molecular biology and ancient traditions of the body and medicine, etc. First of all, let's start from a very well-known fact, two well-known facts. So first of all, I don't know if you can recognize the first quote on the right. It's the first page of a very famous book, and I still find this quote very shocking. And the first time I read it, I felt very strange, but now I understand a bit more. So this is Linda Smith, Decolonizing Methodologies. That's the first page of the book, where she says the word research itself is probably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous words vocabulary. When mentioned in many indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence, it conjures up bad memories, it raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. It is so powerful that indigenous people even write poetry about research. And it's very powerful way of telling something which, again, for us, very rarely or never has a bad connotation, right? What is a bad connotation for us is the lack of research or lack of funding for research, certainly not research. But this is well documented. For instance, I come to the difference between genetics and epigenetics. I want to say, to simplify the story, that whereas genetics was significantly rejected by indigenous population as an attempt, again, to, it was called the Human Genome Diversity Project, was renamed the Vampire Project because of the attempt to take DNA samples from indigenous populations, etc. So whereas genetics has been massively resisted by indigenous populations, they've raised concerns over issues of consent, cultural ownership, use and abuse of DNA and other bodily products, and the many differences between scientific and indigenous understandings of bodies and kinship. So let's say in the early 2000s, we had this very, very big divide between leading cutting-edge molecular biology research around the Human Genome Project and the Human Genome Diversity Project and indigenous populations. This has and this is the point we have made in this article, in sharp contrast to this resistance to genetic research, the recent rise of epigenetics has been embraced by indigenous peoples in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States in a very significant way. So I want to show a few examples of this embrace, which of course is not, it's very interesting culturally, this kind of shift. It's basically a shift, as you will see from these many citations, where this is an experience that has happened to me not just with indigenous Australians, but with Indian scholars, with Russian scholars, where they are basically saying that through epigenetics, Western science is finally catching up with what they have already known, which is basically, as you will see from these different citations, that there is not a clear boundary between the individual and the milieu, that there is not a clear boundary between the individual and the genealogical origins and family histories, and what has happened in family history has a deep impact on the body of the present generation. Temporality is seen in a much more circular rather than linear way, and this is also, as you will see in a moment, connected to some ideas in epigenetics. And on the top of all this resonance between, let's say, indigenous epistemologies and epigenetics, sorry, I should have said something about it, it's environmentally driven modification of gene expression. And it's mostly looked at through changes in food, in stress, or other external factors that they can impact gene functioning. But the other part of the story, so there is in part this story of the resonance between indigenous epistemologies and epigenetics as a more non-linear, complex view of gene, body, and environment relationship. There is also this notion of giving biological evidence for colonial trauma, which is also has been taken up very significantly as an argument. Of course, this is where the history of political biology is interesting. This argument can be taken up in two ways: as a way to stigmatize people as, too damaged to be worth of any kind of intervention. And this has happened a lot. And this was not through genetics argument, but through environmental-based kind of racism. Irish had starved because of famine in a way that they are now a sort of damaged population, not because they have different genes, but because of their poverty. But at the same time, it's very much taken up as a notion that, well, we have now even scientific evidence of the damage caused by colonial dispossession, etc. And this is increasingly being used in debates about restitution and compensation, etc. A particular incorporation by indigenous scholars in Australia has been of what is called DOHAD. I don't know if you have heard what DOHAD is, Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. It's a sort of growing area in public health epidemiology and developmental biology. It was named before fetal programming. So it is basically the notion that there is an intrauterine origin of adult chronic diseases. So, for instance, obesity epidemics, rather than being explained because of faulty genes or the mismatch between genes designed during the Stone Age and the kind of food we consume today, is very much described as the effects of these changes during the developmental period. It's one of the sort of social arms of the movement is called First 1,000 Days campaign. So the notion is that it's the first 1,000 days that matters a lot. But more and more, and this is the study that Michelle Pentecost has done and Natasha has done as well, preconception matters as well. So it's not just what happens in utero, it's what happens before conceiving a child. So this preconception time is coming under frame increasingly, and you will see how this is well connected to Ayurveda notions of preconception. But you see, these are a few quote from interviews to indigenous scholars that have been carried out by my colleague Megan Waring about this notion of developmental origins of health and disease, which is usually, this is the logo of the DOAD movement. It's usually, you see, there is a word which is also a womb, and there is a baby in the womb, and then there is, in this case, Latin America. So it's this very much notion of being embedded, and at the same time of a time that is original. This is the source of some future developments, which is the intrauterine time. So we really are linked to our past. This is an indigenous scholar through mechanisms such as epigenetics, microbiomes, telomeres, and others, and giving you a cyclical view of health across generations and science. I'm giving you a cyclical view of health across generations. And science is catching up with that spiritual view of health. In response to her presentation, a British-Australian geneticist from the audience suggested that epigenetics is almost a plausibility of what Aboriginal people have known for thousands of years. And I got these same comments by very big profile leading scholars, one of whom is this guy here, Professor Chittajan Jainik, is the inventor of this, discoverer of this thin fat Indian syndrome, whereas Indian babies are small but have much more fat than other babies, for instance, European babies. So they are at the same time thin and fat, and he's studying this from an epigenetic developmental point of view. But he made exactly to me the same comment. Oh, we have known this is epigenetic fact through Ayurveda books for ages, It's just that Western science is catching up. The fact that you are predetermined, for instance, to obesity by the behavior of your ancestors. How your grandmother ate, how your father ate or smoked or behaved is having an impact on your... Well, I have to say, I've never published this because I think I can share this. So the guy who wrote a very, very famous study that brought back Lamarck on the third page of Nature, on the intergenerational transmissions of fears in mice. One of the two authors, I spoke to him, he's of Indian origin, and in a funny conversation, he told me that this is karma. This is this transmission of olfactive fear through stress in rats for him was not incredible as it is for us. So I don't know, I don't want to overdo the story here, but definitely there is something of interest that is happening here. Yeah, so many of these quotes would say basically, Western science is finally getting to where we were already. Which is a very different understanding, the older story I told you from Darwinism to genetics, right? Yeah, so I already mentioned this is twice in the slides, shouldn't be. Yeah, so this is another quote from an indigenous interviewee at this conference of DOAD in Australia. The idea that pregnancy begins at conception is not how pregnancy is considered. When you hear people talk about song lines, and they use song lines to talk about generations of families and how they follow song lines, and people can talk about those song lines begin long before women show that they are pregnant. So I think the biological point of conception is not necessarily understood or valued. It is understood that babies are considered formed long before the point of conception. In the spiritual realm, it has much more than the biological DOAD explanation. It goes back to where life begins in the spirit form. Okay, now very briefly, why would epigenetics be a particularly likely candidate to bridge a supposed divide between Western and indigenous or non-Western science? I think I can give three answers. One is that epigenetics was conceived in a very peculiar cultural scientific environment by a number of biologists and scientists, the most famous of which, the most important of which for epigenetics is Conrad Waddington. But this group of people were sort of, and were doing some of global history of science until our period. One member of the group was Joseph Needham, who of course is very famous for his history of science and technology, Chinese civilization. And I think that this notion of an attempt to bring together a science that doesn't happen only in the usual places, but goes beyond that, was from the very beginning part of what epigenetics was trying to think about. So that's one reason. The second reason for me is that there is an obvious gender dimension in epigenetics, in the sense that this is a point that Evelyn Fox-Keller made many years ago, that developmental biology somehow, for the metaphors it uses, the process it describes, has a more, let's say, feminist tone than classical master DNA controlling the process. This is very much about sort of feedback, loop feedback between the cell, the RNA, the DNA, the wider organism, etc. And there is, I think, a very, I wouldn't say unusual, but very visible contribution of female scholars to the history of epigenetics: Susan Oyama, Eva Jablonka, Evelyn Fox-Keller, and Barbara McClintock, of course, although she preceded epigenetics, but she spoke of this notion of the sensitive genome that has been taken up today with notions of reactive genome, etc. And then for me, epigenetics, if I look at the history of practices and behavior, is very much also the return and vindication of a longer history of body permeability that, of course, reconnects very much European medicine to non-Western medicine about this notion of body permeability and dealing with exchange with the external environment and being imprinted by the environment, etc. Just very briefly, what Natasha Rune is doing, PhD student at Deakin University. She has, unfortunately, her PhD has started with COVID, so not an easy situation. But luckily, there was this online conference on Ayurveda and epigenetics, from which she did a very good ethnography. And again, many of the presentations were very interesting, this attempt to bring together Ayurvedic terms with epigenetic terms, Ayurvedic figures with epigenetic figures. This is an example, for instance, how they translated genotype, phenotype, transmission of character into Ayurvedic terms. They have a very specific story of preconception care, which is this Garbha Sanskar, which is how you can influence a child even before he's born. So there are typically this Ayurveda pre-pregnancy clinic where especially rich couples go and they want to conceive in 2 to 3 years. So they start all a preparation that is based basically on the 6 Galenic non-natural. So basically it's mental rest, good food, exercise. It's not much new. Sometimes this has also rationalized attempt. It is to conceive babies who are whiter, So this story is quite complex. But Natasha is working on this area, and she sort of tried to see how these different words begin to collide at the same time, to resonate between them. There are other experiences which I find interesting beside epigenetics and the Ayurveda. We can talk more about that maybe in the Q&A. This is another case. This is not my research, but this is another case that I found inspiring. This is a biology class that has been taken by these Buddhist monks, and again it is the attempt to translate some of the key notions of modern scientific biology in Buddhist terms. It's very interesting. Some of these notebooks are quite fascinating. I think I want just to wrap up quickly so that we go then to Q&A. I would say, in theoretical terms, we should recognize that while biology, biomedicine, and evolution are undoubtedly a European occurrence in this sense of the modern history of evolution, they originate, sorry for the mistake, they originate in a dialectical relation with non-Europe, paraphrasing Enrique Dussel. And the question we should ask is how much the life sciences are engulfed in whiteness. That's a question that Deepesh Chakrabarty asks about deep history science. There are opportunities which includes overcoming structural barriers and epistemic injustice in global knowledge production. But again, my initial comment on my student in Palestine tells also that we have very limited power. There are challenges, one of which is producing genuine global and polyphonic knowledge at a time of intense monolingualism in the academia, and the monolingualism can be also an issue for the decolonizing movement itself, if those graphs I gave at the beginning about being very much on the rise in the English language are true. The challenge is that this may become a bandwagon and, it'd be easily absorbed in a sort of greenwashing kind of style. There are authors like Yves Tuck and Kim Yang that are, they don't accept the use of decolonization in this metaphoric way as I've done today. They, by decolonization, mean the restitution of lands, etc. So it's a debate which is important to recognize. There are risks, one of which is the scientific realism and capacity to distinguish valuable science and forms of knowledge expertise from flawed epistemologies. Would be a big problem in post-pandemic, post-truth Anthropocene times. The question I started with is, I think, the question that guides a bit my research at this point. So if a decolonized biology can deliver a better biology and understanding of health, bodies, and ecological processes, and doing so for more people. Moving ahead, the practical suggests I'm not going to this. There are so many advice and guidelines about research with indigenous communities. But theoretically, I just want to say these three quick things. So one is from this very important book, Asia's Method, where I think this is particularly important, that we need to break the limit of the colonial imagination and the kind of resentment as well that the colonial imagination produces. Because the resentment, again, is simply, getting back at the empire rather than thinking of a different world. So he speaks, Chang Kuan-Sing, by multiplying the objects of identification and constructing alternative frames of reference, we undo the politics of resentment. I think this is important. Then, this is another Indian historian, Kapil Rai, beyond dominant vision of colonial science as hegemonic European enterprise, or more recent perception of it as a simpler reordering of existing indigenous knowledge within the European canon, seeking the complex reciprocity and hybridization involved in the making of science within the colonial context. I think the example of molecular biology / epigenetics and Ayurveda is a good example in this sense. And also walking the narrow path between, I would say, rigid positivism and new forms of fetishization or of the other, which is also a major issue on neo-Orientalism, would be also an important part of the story. Many of these things are happening right now. These debates are happening in major scientific journals. So this is an important shift. There is lots on decolonizing paleontology, botany, ethnobiology. This is very interesting, I think, because some of these articles are in major mainstream scientific journals like Science or Scientific American, etc. And this is a very nice painting at an exhibition I visited before leaving Melbourne in July. This gives a bit of a sense of this complexity of the indigenous cosmology and this folded, entangled forms. This notion of circularity is very present. This picture is called Shadow Spirit Rising immersion in ancestral systems of knowledge. And I recognize Art Knowledge funding from the Australian Research Council for this research. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Mauricio, por la excelente presentación.
Thank you very much for your lecture, Maurizio. First of all, this, it's very rich. Your speech was very rich with many contents, in fact, that it's difficult to understand how they are in relation. But I have a simple question is, for example, if we talk about a decolonized biology, for example, or geography, it's the same biology. Maybe we can continue talking about biology. Of what we are talking about? It's biology. It's a new knowledge. It's a new system. It's a new because this is I think this is a main question to think about it. Because we are talking in global health, Abimbola says, is it possible to decolonize global health? Yeah. If we decolonize global health, maybe we are talking about another system, another knowledge, another practices, maybe related to another exchange between countries, between cultures, between perceptions, for example, in terms of more than a give exchange, than a commodity exchange, which is the hegemonic exchange nowadays when we are talking about knowledge, when we are talking about the relationship between the global and the south, the north, the global north, and on the global south. So it's a simple question, but for me it's difficult to answer. What do you think about it?
Well, it's a good question, but I think my answer would be at different levels. So first of all, we know already by fact that, for instance, giving a very simple example, that the theory of evolution as conceived by Darwin, when it was exported, so to speak, into Russia, and speaking of pre-Soviet Russia, there is a very famous book by a guy called Todd, I think, on this. It was immediately, Russian scientists immediately felt this old emphasis on competition and overcrowded population, etc., reflect very poorly the ecology they knew in Russia. So they had a different take, keeping the sort of core story of Darwin alive, but they emphasize much more cooperation. Again, this is not to romanticize, but it is to say that we know very well that Darwin histories, and Marx made the point very famously, it's the British society translated into nature. Marx who had the utmost respect. This is another point that has not to be overlooked. When Marx said that, at the same time he wanted Darwin to write the preface for the Capital. So it's not that by saying that Darwin projected the value of a competitive rich society into nature, and he did so via Malthus, certainly. He meant by this that he was doing a bad science. He simply was, I think, saying he was doing a certain type of science, which could be, enlarged by other stories in science, like the example of the Russian emphasis on cooperation. I mean, this is one answer. The other answer is that biology is not an eternal object of nature, right? It has been invented at some point in 81 or 82, let's say by Lamarck or other people. That's very interesting too, because we are at the very center of, the peak of imperial and colonial enterprises. But before biology, there wasn't biology. There was, let's say, with Foucault, natural history or whatever we want to call it. And biology, as we know, is the Greek for science of life. Ayurveda is the Hindi for science of life as well. So again, I don't know, maybe there will be a bioecology of something in the future. I'm still using Greek terms. And again, this is our own indigeneity, right, that we use Greek terms. But I wouldn't be...
But beyond the label biology or Ayurveda biology, blah, 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 the content of the knowledge is clearly different because you show us these stories about telomeres and about bioma. It's very interesting, but maybe they are changing the point of view, the perspective, and also the content, the knowledge itself. No, this is it's a question. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, well, I would say that if you say genetics today compared to 30 years ago, a student of genetics would tell you, well, genes are important, but they are part of a wider architecture of cellular signals, blah, blah, blah. So it's still genetics. Well, it's not Mendelian genetics anymore. For sure, it's no longer also DNA genetics as we knew that in the 70s or the 90s. So yeah, I don't have a clear answer. I think there is an ongoing movement. The point is which forces are going to contribute to this or not, I think. And this is going to be the question. Thank you.
Bueno, Mauricio, muchas gracias por tu conferencia. Como siempre, hay muchas cosas en ella y es difícil, como dice Ángel, encontrar exactamente el hilo conductor y más allá de tu un poco free association, pero siempre muy interesante. La pregunta que yo tengo va hacia el comienzo de tu charla y tiene que ver con todo el discurso decolonial, postcolonial. Ya sabemos que son cosas diferentes, pero es mi impresión, después de haberme también sumergido en esta literatura, de que implica un par de tensiones o de paradojas. Una de ellas, que yo nunca la vi examinada o discutida en ninguno de los autores, es que la mayor parte, me parece a mí por lo menos, de los autores africanos y por lo menos latinoamericanos, africanos y latinoamericanos, que son las grandes figuras de este movimiento, de este universo intelectual, trabajan en universidades prestigiosas en Estados Unidos. Y yo nunca he visto en ninguna entrevista con ellos, ningún escrito, ningún comentario, que esto se tematice, ¿no? Que esto se señale. Yo creo que valdría la pena hacerlo, ¿no? Es un poco superficial, tal vez forma un poco parte de este tipo de una distribución geográfica de los papas y popes del descolonialismo y del postcolonialismo. Sería interesante, de la misma manera que hiciste el engrama, sería interesante estudiar una distribución geográfica y tratar de sacar algún tipo de conclusión sobre ese fenómeno. Yo tengo mis propias conclusiones, pero como son muy informales, o intuiciones, como son informales, no las voy a comunicar. Ese es el primer punto. El otro punto, que en realidad está relacionado, es que algunos autores que a mí me parecen muy interesantes, entre ellos en particular Olufemi Taiwo, han formulado críticas muy radicales hacia la idea de descolonialismo, la idea de postcolonialismo, ¿no es cierto? Y creo que la crítica se puede resumir diciendo que, en el fondo, lo que hacen estos conceptos es volver a poner Europa en el centro, es volver a poner el fenómeno del colonialismo en el centro y es negar toda la historia que existe antes del fenómeno colonial. Este es el mensaje de Olufemi Taiwo, ¿no es cierto?, en un libro y en muchos artículos. Se trata simplemente de eso, ¿no?, de señalar que, bueno, pues que los países, las regiones, las poblaciones, etcétera, etcétera, que se examinan a través de estas lentes, ¿no es cierto?, del post y del descolonial, pues tienen una historia anterior y que no se definen solamente en términos de lo postcolonial y lo descolonial. Es cierto que hoy en día, como se ve muy bien, por ejemplo, en el ámbito de los estudios medioambientales y otros, esas poblaciones, digamos, indígenas, el caso australiano es patente, han adoptado para sí mismas y han aprovechado el discurso postcolonial y decolonial. Pero han adoptado algo que viene totalmente de afuera, que viene de las universidades norteamericanas, que viene de los pensadores europeos, etcétera, etcétera. Y bueno, esto me parece problemático, a lo mejor no es problemático, pero mi intuición es que sí, es un problema que hay que abordar y yo no lo veo demasiado claramente abordado, excepto en algunos autores como Taiwo. En todo caso, no entre los papas y popes del descolonialismo y del postcolonialismo. Bueno, son comentarios, pero me gustaría saber tu reacción, tus ideas sobre estos dos temas.
Thank you, Fernando. Yeah, I think that Taiwo was also based in the United States, by the way. Taiwo is based in some, yes.
No sé, puede ser,
yeah.
Puede ser.
Yeah, look, I don't, it was not my goal to sponsor decolonial or postcolonial literature in this talk. My goal was to try to see how engulfed in whiteness, I think this was my question, how engulfed in whiteness is the history of biology? And I think this is a legitimate question wherever these people are based. I'm not entirely sure this is true for all of this. I mean, Achille Mbembe is not based in the United States. He's an important
Uno de los pocos, one of the few ones, yes.
Pero he's an important one. I mean, Enrique Dussel is a complicated story because he was a disciple of... Sì, ma he was a disciple of Paul Ricoeur, so of course he's a European thinker as well. I mean, that's a complicated story. I'm not interested in a purifying exercise where I say this is going to be another form of racism, not what you are suggesting, but the attempt to say, oh, I'm pure enough. Again, I told my positionality at the very beginning. I can only respond with regard to my own career. I've been always in this inside-outside situation, and this has been helpful to understand epistemic conflicts. About these people, it's a good point. I see what you're saying, and that there is a bubble and a bandwagon, and this is going to become, of course, widely overstated. This has happened with many other stories. I've been working on Foucauldianism a bit in sociology, and how it has become a canon. I titled an article an unproblematized truth, joking on the problematization in Foucault, and the same you can do for decolonizing. So I don't think this is the key issue. The key issue is where we are going with this capacity to enlarge our cognitive framework and recognize the existence of epistemic injustice. The past, I think, actually, it's a very important topic to look at the erasure of longue durée history as part of a colonial branding of modernity as exceptional and unprecedented and unique. So this is also a topic on which I have been focusing a lot. I, for instance, don't believe that the history of racism started with black slavery, Atlantic trade. I've written on this, that the history of racism begins, at least in the West, with Aristotle and Hippocrates' division of Asians and Europeans based on climatic differences, which turns into political. So, I'm also skeptical of this. Anyway, so I'm with you for many, many things. I think, though, there are genuine questions to answer here. And I still think that the notion that Darwin wanted to buy 2 rifles and that they travel with 3 stolen indigenous people, it doesn't invalidate Darwin's theory, but it gives us an insight on the tacit knowledge of the time upon which this kind of knowledge was built. I think this is a fair comment to do. But thank you for your point, and when you say free association,
muchísimas cosas interesantes, se podría decir muchas cosas. Bueno, algunas observaciones y una cuestión más de fondo. ¿Por qué posicionalidad? ¿Por qué hay que empezar hablando de posicionalidad? Posicionalidad también es una forma de simplificar cosas que son mucho más complejas, ¿no? Tú puedes ser blanco europeo, pero ser al mismo tiempo de clase trabajadora, que tuvo que trabajar para pagarse los estudios, en cuanto que el otro que viene de un país del Global South era parte de la élite, ¿entiendes? O sea, eso me parece una cosa. Y además, hasta muchas veces perniciosa. Por ejemplo, nuestros alumnos aquí cada vez hacen más autoetnografías, o sea, es una forma siempre de reflexionar sobre sí mismo. Yo tengo ciertas dificultades con eso. Decolonial, postcolonial, etcétera. Tiene un poco que ver con lo que ha dicho Fernando, en el sentido de que la palabra decolonial es en sí misma colonial, porque decolonial solo tiene ese significado en inglés y en alemán. Inglés y alemán son las únicas palabras donde se pone el prefijo de con el sentido de ser el contrario. En español no existe decolonial, en portugués no existe decolonial, en francés no existe decolonial. Entonces, usar la propia palabra decolonial ya es en sí mismo una empresa colonial. Y siempre es el mismo asunto, lo que decía, por ejemplo, Fernando, Enrique Dus, Walter Mignolo en Duke University, etcétera, pero llega hasta el punto de que, por ejemplo, en el campo de Global Health, en un debate en McGill en 2012 famoso que hubo sobre Global Mental Health, una de las críticas que se hacían era precisamente eso. Le decían al Vikram Patel: usted, que es el psiquiatra indio, pero que trabaja en la época en London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, ahora en Harvard. Y ahí él respondía, no, fue en un debate con Saraceno, con el Benedito Saraceno, y le respondía a Saraceno: no, pero yo vivo la mitad del año en India, ¿no? Decía, no, me divido entre, o sea, como que esa necesidad de disculparse, ¿no? O sea, cómo muestra todo eso, los entanglements que hay ahí, que son bastante complejos en toda esa cosa. Pero la cuestión que más me ha llamado la atención y que te quería comentar es sobre precisamente la idea de la epigenética como la ciencia que es verdaderamente decolonial, ¿no? Descolonial o algo de eso. Eso me parece bastante interesante, porque, bueno, primero, una cosa interesante, es un fenómeno anglo. O sea, decolonial en el mundo anglo. En el mundo no anglo, en el sentido, incluyendo Australia, porque muchos de los cuando hablan anglo es Anglo-American y Australia se queda de fuera, o sea, has traído a Australia. En el mundo no anglo no existe eso. O sea, esa apropiación de indigenous knowledge por excolonias no británicas no existe. Son todas excolonias británicas. India es una colonia británica. Pero, por ejemplo, en América Latina, esa idea en las colonias portuguesas y españolas de usar, por ejemplo, la epigenética para pedir reparación por la época, por el trauma colonial, etcétera, no existe. Es básicamente un fenómeno muy anglo, tengo la impresión, porque en Brasil, donde he vivido muchos años, yo no lo he visto. Entonces, ya en sí es una visión decolonial de las excolonias británicas. Eso me parece importante. Y lo que me parece importante, y es una cosa que Fernando y yo hemos estudiado en relación a las neurociencias, es, de alguna manera, es siempre la ciencia que da la validez. O sea, de alguna manera es la medicina tradicional, Ayurveda o cualquier otra cosa que de nuevo necesita de la ciencia para decir esa es la verdadera imagen, la verdadera ontología, la verdadera noción de biología, etcétera. O sea, de alguna manera en sí es muy colonial hacer eso. O sea, apelar de nuevo a la ciencia, porque es una ciencia que se considera ciencia. Nadie considera la epigenetics, macrobioma, etcétera, como siendo no ciencia, porque existían otras apropiaciones de otras visiones de la ciencia que son próximas de esas visiones del mundo. Por ejemplo, la física cuántica. La física cuántica, antes de la epigenética, era todo lo que todas las culturas, ayurveda, budismo, etcétera, llamaba como diciendo esa es una visión del mundo, de la realidad, que está mucho más cerca de nuestra visión del mundo no occidental. Pero la física cuántica para mucha gente era quatsch, era pseudociencia. Ahora no, ahora tenemos una ciencia de verdad, con experimentos y tal, que de nuevo vamos a usar para reclamar nuestros derechos decoloniales. Pero bueno, usted está haciendo una cosa tremendamente colonial, que es apuntar a la ciencia de punta hecha en los laboratorios de los Estados Unidos, etcétera, con una industria farmacéutica por detrás que va a ganar dinero con epigenetics, con microbioma, etcétera, para hacer un decolonial claim. Eso es lo que me llama la atención. O sea, que no hay una autorreflexión sobre cómo eso en sí es una práctica colonial. No sé si has pensado sobre eso.
These are all very good questions and difficult to answer briefly. I mean, I really don't disagree neither with Fernando or you. I'm very sympathetic to what you're asking. And again, my talk had a question mark at the beginning, and I believe that keeping the question mark now is important. You have asked many things, Paco. I'm a bit lost now. So what was the point? No, but the first point was interesting too. What did you say at the beginning? Sorry. Before.
La primera cosa me refería como que la propia toda esa relación de epigenetics como una ciencia decolonial y usado por grupos indígenas para pedir compensaciones es algo propio de las colonias británicas.
There was something before you asked, but no.
La propia palabra decolonial solo funciona en inglés y en alemán. Usar el término ya es colonial.
Yeah, look, I'll answer for what I know about your question. I mean, epigenetics, of course, is many things. You know, it's the crap science popularizer that tells you that if you watch 20 times a day someone running, your brain gets, I don't know, more capable to run tomorrow, or things like that. So can be many things. We know very well that, you know, there is quackery in many well-established sciences as well. Behavioral economics can be one example, or other examples are also full of problems. Epigenetics is not so much consolidated, though, as an establishment science. There was a very famous episode of the Royal British Society 4 years ago when Eva Jablonka was invited to speak, and there was 25 people signed a letter saying, this is like homeopathy. We are not going to have epigenetics discussed. And everyone has always said to Eva, you don't even have a lab. She's a woman from Tel Aviv, it's definitely, at least scientifically, not a mainstream place to be, although it's very prestigious as a university. But anyway, so epigenetics has also this interesting being in two spaces epistemically, between credibility and lack of authority and recognition. It's not true, though, that all epigenetics labs are in Euro-Americas. I mean, there are a few important in India. But again, when we made these arguments, I understand, I hear what Fernando is saying, that these people are all in American universities, that many of the labs are in Euro-Americas. But then we have the practical situation of my PhD student, Samia, who is stopped in Nablus. And what I'm supposed to say to Samia, no, you stay in Nablus because otherwise you lose your Global South name. So if you get a job at Duke University, I'm allowed to tell her, no, you stay under the bombs, please, because otherwise I lose a Global South partner. So I don't know. This is, for me, very tricky. No, I remember your first question about positionality. I honestly don't believe in the author. I'm very much of a structuralist in this sense. I honestly, my daughters, who are nearly 9, ask me, Daddy, are you important? Because you travel a lot. I said, I always tell them, which is something I really believe. I said, I'm not important, but the topics I discuss are. So I think my positionality in this is is this one, is these 3 lines. I've never written a line more about myself in 20 years. So it's not about a sort of narcissistic kind of thing. It's just a disclosure of interest, so to speak. It's like a disclosure of interest at the end of an article.
Es lo inverso de la ciencia. La ciencia es la capacidad de salir de sí mismo para hablar de cosas mayores. O sea, hasta qué punto tu punto de vista es relevante para lo que vas a contar. O sea, yo no lo he visto como una cosa egocéntrica. Lo he visto porque es necesario decir desde qué lugar hablamos, de cualquier cosa que hablamos, para que nos puedan decir, de eso no puedes hablar. Porque en el fondo lo que se trata es de marcar el territorio de lo que me es permitido de hablar como hombre blanco, italiano, heterosexual, etcétera. O sea, ese es para mí el problema.
No, digo que es más complejo porque, claro, desde mi punto de vista lo que ha pasado es que hay una epistemología positivista. Se ha alejado teóricamente y ha sido inmune a temas asociados con valores, ética, justicia social. Entonces, me parece que aquí hay una reivindicación un poco en el sentido de decir, no hay concepto de evidencia, no hay verdad si no hay justicia social. Entonces, hay la necesidad de una cierta reparación. Y no se puede imponer esa noción de verdad como si fuese algo que viene de Marte o de la galaxia, ¿no? Porque es una producción humana que está atravesada por intereses y por también ejercicios de dominación. Pero yo creo que el desafío más interesante que hay en todos estos sistemas y en todas estas aperturas, que yo creo que pueden ser interesantes para la ciencia, en el sentido de abrir el horizonte y de transformar lo que entendemos hoy como ciencia. Porque es el viejo debate de cómo construimos la ciencia, desde la visión de unos pocos, con el modelo experimental, etcétera, o lo abrimos a otras sensibilidades, otras formas de conocimiento, algunas de ellas que ya estaban presentes en la época de Darwin y de Spencer y de otros muchos, y que luego han sido descartadas. Por ejemplo, todo lo que es la dimensión cualitativa. Los naturalistas eran muy cualitativistas, finalmente, ¿no? Y esto es menospreciado. Entonces, ¿hasta qué punto lo que entendemos como ciencia, entendido como un método de conocimiento que busca la verdad y que sobre todo lo que más importante o me resulta más atrayente del método científico es su falsabilidad, ¿no? La posibilidad de que los resultados son falsables, no puede enriquecerse con esos otros elementos y también con la autocrítica que deviene de decir, cuidado, porque no se ha producido un ejercicio de reparación y porque estáis anclando un concepto de evidencia como si fuese una realidad aséptica cuando es producto de las voluntades humanas y por tanto no podemos desligarla de la justicia social, de la ética y de la justicia social, ¿no? A mí ese lado sí que me parece interesante. No, sí que tiene, porque tú estás hablando del método científico como algo que...
No, hablas de la capacidad de no caer en el puro nominalismo. Solamente eso.
No, pero es que son cosas, claro, hay excesos desde mi punto de vista por reacción, pero se puede reconducir. De hecho, la propia idea de decolonial, que estoy de acuerdo contigo, que es colonial en sí misma, yo me planteo hasta qué punto no es una especie de vacuna ante la reacción, ¿no? Es igual que en su momento los jesuitas fueron a América Latina y fueron los apóstoles de la colonialidad, ahora estos nuevos apóstoles de la decolonialidad, que están en Estados Unidos, como hemos comentado antes, ¿cuál es su función realmente, más allá de sus voluntades subjetivas y específicas, ¿no? Es decir, ¿a qué responde socialmente en el ciclo? Y además quizás estamos hablando de colonial en un momento en que estamos ante el declive del modelo occidental, probablemente frente a China y frente a otras potencias, no solo económicas, sino también científicas.
I just have one quick question. It's regarding, I guess, what you could kind of call as a social justice within health research and the systems that have guided the biomedical model and research that has guided that, and then health outcomes that have been affected by that. And I think historically, however you want to look at it, there's been this acceptance of what Darwin's theory of evolution has affected racist health models, etc. No? And now it's like, oh wait, that was wrong actually. That we were kind of misguided in that, and all of the science and the health research and the impacts that it's had on certain social groups socioeconomic groups, it's sort of negatable. Like, oh, we actually now it's epigenetics, and with this epigenetics, in fact, all the native or the traditional or the non-biomedical health research that was very little looked into before and was kind of looked at as a secondary model is now seen as a focal point and has become quite important in the conversations that we're having about health outcomes. And because of that, they're getting more introduced and more involved in what is being impacted people now. And I wonder how, in that sense, we have to be careful in saying like, oh, well, we made a mistake. It's actually epigenetics. And in fact, that thing that people don't measure, like culture or the soul, we actually kind of call it karma because there's something beyond the bio. My question, I guess, is how do we recognize that all along the very people that were sort of silenced throughout history because of colonialism were kind of not right in the sense that there's a right or wrong, but in the danger in ignoring that conversation in the future can also have bad health outcomes in certain groups. I don't know if that's really a question, but it's
so
just...
You are saying how is this possibly repeated again in this new framework?
Yeah.
How this new framework can repeat some of the same pattern?
Yeah, and also...
what would be an example? Sorry, I'm not...
I don't know, because now it's such a new area and it's...
Replacing genetics. That's not the case. It's like a new layer of information, which, of course, has become increasingly under focus of science for a number of reasons, including the cheap availability of technology that can quickly and easily decipher. I mean, sorry, I'm speaking again about Samia. She wanted to come to Australia taking blood sample and saliva sample from Palestinian people, and it's very cheap and quick to do an epigenetic measurement. There are, of course, a number of things to adjust. So there are a number of reasons why this has come into focus, which are technologically driven, etc. I think this comes to partly to what Angel was asking. Maybe this is an interesting answer, perhaps. So a typical genetic model of disease or behavior, maybe 30 years ago, would just require a very good chemist or DNA specialist or biometrician capable to do some measurement and research, etc. Nowadays, at least in principle, if you want to design a serious research experiment in epigenetics, stress in a fish, I don't know, some different impact of maternal stress on rats, something like that. You need to know something about stress. You need to know something about maternal effects. So this, at least by itself, enlarge the focus of biology to collaboration with other disciplines, which by itself may be the driver of some change in the nature of our, I didn't have the time to go into the slides are no longer here anymore in any case, but again, DNA, how it's represented today is much less, the sequence of G, T, A, C letters. Is much more, for instance, like a bridge with all number of connection to, transcription factors, RNA functions, etc. So this is just an enrichment in the history of science, which it's an enrichment that I don't think any geneticist would deny, because they were very aware of the fact they were doing something very narrow because they needed something narrow in order to make progress in the science. So I don't see this as a process that is disruptive of the growth of scientific knowledge. I find actually this as an amazing opportunity, and I find actually that the disruptive nature has been not just colonialism, but for instance in the history of genetics, the Cold War effect. It is very well known. That's another case for you, Angel, that because of the Lysenko effect in the Soviet Union, all scientists who were working, even in the West, on cytoplasmic inheritance or non-Mendelian inheritance, at some point their research was discontinued because it was considered too close to kind of Lamarckian effects. So this had a disruptive effect on science. And again, a science in which there is more collaboration between, multiple voices, I think can be simply, so I would take this kind of stance. I'm not particularly intrigued by the notion of incommensurability of things like that, because then you get to serious health crisis and you need just something that delivers good responses. Another example, I haven't discussed it, I'm not an expert, but there is lots of experiences in how traditional knowledge has been incorporated into ecological experiments and ecological issues. Inuits population realizing that the gooses or other ducks were about to die very quickly. That was not predicted by any ecologists in the north. There are plenty of examples like that where traditional knowledge. Of course, there are criticisms by anthropologists how this is a management of traditional knowledge that is incorporated into. Again, these debates will be always with us. That's not the problem. But I think it shows a direction in which we are going. Now you read in Nature Ecology articles where traditional knowledge is represented at least as a viable, source of information for. So I think this shows some kind of awareness, of the limits of our own knowledge, for instance, I made the example before in the car of this article I reviewed in the Anthropocene Review about the Earth as asthma, acidification in oceans being compared by a scientist in a very scientific journal to the Earth having asthma. So, and again, reconnected to a longer history where Aristotle thought that he would say earthquakes is the farting of the earth or things like that. This kind of microcosmo, macrocosmo metaphors, why is this scientist using this now? I think these are questions about the limit of the Enlightenment experience itself and how science is asking questions. I'm just curious to see where this goes. I don't have a clear answer, but I think it's genuine to ask what does this mean for the future of knowledge. So.
Gracias Mauricio. Pero yo quería hacer quizás un comentario en lo que traía Paco también, las dos cosas, dos cuestiones que planteaba Paco. Por un lado, yo hago una lectura o interpreto la utilización de la epigenética por estos grupos sin conocer demasiado, Es una lectura que hago así a partir de lo que dices. Desde una cuestión estratégica, un uso estratégico de la epigenética para justificar o para buscar respuesta. Incorporo algo de la lectura hegemónica para poder reclamar algo que tiene que ver con algo más ancestral. Es como una acción, un acto casi estratégico, no tanto de que incorpora, no, sería un tema para investigar, hasta qué punto incorporan verdaderamente la idea de que la única validación posible es a través de la epigenética, y hasta qué punto no es una acción estratégica para buscar una validación en un campo o a partir de un campo en el cual creen que es más fácil conseguir respuesta, ¿no? O sea, no sé si los movimientos sociales están utilizando a veces este tipo de movimientos de un modo estratégico. Ok, voy a utilizar tu lenguaje o voy a utilizar tu modo de ver el mundo para tratar de recuperar algo de lo que me pertenece, ¿no? Y por otro lado, en relación también a lo que decía Paco, que también tampoco sé si entendí muy bien por dónde ibas, pero ya escuché varias veces que planteas este tema de pedir disculpas. Yo también me he encontrado con, por ejemplo, muchos en el campo de la salud mental, muchos psiquiatras que se sienten en ese lugar de pedir disculpas, pero yo lo separaría o lo distinguiría de la importancia de poner en evidencia desde dónde uno está hablando. Es simplemente eso, es desde dónde hablo, desde qué lugar hablo, porque tiene que ver con los sesgos en la mirada y en la interpretación. Uno puede evidenciar ciertos sesgos. Yo creo que cuando uno asume una posición, asume una mirada y pone en evidencia los sesgos posibles. No sé si no me incomoda, me parece interesante decir, bueno, desde dónde estoy hablando, cuál es mi universo desde el cual me posiciono para observar esto, ¿no? Y es cierto que es algo que se está empezando a hacer casi sistemáticamente, pero me parece interesante porque nuestra mirada, claro, construye el mundo, como sabemos, por más que siempre hay que no te da. Hay ciertos campos en donde no hay, es como si no hubiese legitimidad para hablar, y yo creo que en algunos campos es difícil tener legitimidad para hablar, es verdad. Hay ciertos campos del nivel de la experiencia del otro que es difícil, pero eso no te quita legitimidad para hablar de ciertos aspectos. Pero
no, solamente añadir a lo que ha dicho Martín para tu respuesta. Primero, en relación al primer punto, mi pregunta no es que deslegitime el uso estratégico de un conocimiento científico para reclamaciones ancestrales y tal. Es que no existe la reflexividad sobre eso. O sea, simplemente no, lo abrazo sin pensar que es una cosa, aunque digas que no es tan dominante la biología, que todavía es marginal, bueno, como pasaba con la neuroplasticidad, pero bueno, es una cosa, o sea, que hay que darse cuenta de cómo, de alguna manera, estoy cayendo en una retórica colonial donde la ciencia es la que tiene la verdad última y ahora me legitima lo que yo hago. O sea, puedo hacer un uso estratégico, pero no perder esa cuestión de reflexividad. Sobre la posicionalidad, a mí lo que me molesta es que yo concibo la academia como un lugar donde la gente se puede desarmar y se tranquilizar y no tener que hablar, porque ¿cuál es el problema de esa posicionalidad? Es el problema de la policía epistémica. De eso no puedes hablar porque eres blanco, de eso no puedes hablar porque eres europeo, de eso no puedes hablar, ¿entiendes? O sea, eso es lo que me molesta, y decir, vamos a crear espacios donde la gente se puede desarmar y no tiene que hablar, es simplemente, ¿por qué no puedo hablar, entender la experiencia de sufrimiento de alguien diferente? No puedo. Entonces, ¿qué es la empatía? ¿Qué es la literatura como una forma de entender una vida que es totalmente diferente a la mía? O sea, si no voy a estar en un mundo... Bueno.
No. It's a very nice important conversation to have, and I mean, you'd say there is lack of self-reflexivity. Again, I want to go back, though, to the point I started with. So how is it possible that in the space of a decade, literally a decade, indigenous groups, for instance, in Australia, have moved from a total rejection of genetics as the most, exploitative, extractivist science possible, to embracing in the most reflective way? I don't know. I don't care at this point. So this is culturally significant. Something must have happened, and there must be something in this story about epigenetics as a open, malleable, reactive view of the genome, etc., that must have intrigued or resonated with or given sense. So this is culturally something that is good to take note of. So again, the positionality point, I would stick to my point. I didn't say this to justify myself. I say this to tell you exactly what is my epistemic skills, if you want. I'm in this gray area. I'm there, but I'm not there. I'm not a real settler, colonial. I'm an immigrant. Maybe I'm no longer an immigrant now because I'm a permanent resident. I don't know how an indigenous scholar would judge me. They usually have, we haven't, the few I've met, I've never seen this happening, what you are saying, this kind of police, or you can't speak about us. I've said lots of things to them in a very frank conversation, and there was never from anyone like, oh, shut up because you are white. There have been moments where they've said, oh, this is white fragility, this is white, but this is, I think, part of an honest conversation between groups. So, I see what you mean in abstract. I think it's not entirely true either, Francisco, that science is this detached view from nowhere, that the observer, I mean, this is a sort of, out there. Yeah.
I didn't say that.
Well, you said that. No, you said that, but you said also that isn't science a process of detachment? Yeah, but coming to science is also a recognition of the positionality of the researcher. This is true in ecology, it's true in quantum physics, it's true in biology, it's true in genetics. And so I don't think in doing this I am disrupting any scientific protocol. It's a bit like a disclosure of interest. I've done this research, but by the way, I've been paid by the company who makes this kind of cream. So if this is different, then I have also PhD students who write only about themselves. This is different than this kind of egolatry or ego delusional kind of stuff. I think having 3 lines where you say, what is your story, what is your positioning, and very to position yourself. But this is interesting about being Italian, that we don't know where we are.
Propongo por la hora que las dos personas pregunten una después de la otra y Mauricio responda. Creo que Sam estaba antes.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la intervención y el debate está siendo súper interesante. Yo te quería comentar 2 cosas. A ver qué piensas. Bueno, una en relación con el debate que estaba viendo en la mesa acerca de las posiciones de enunciación. A mí me parece que hay un ámbito para esta discusión también más extenso, por lo menos en el contexto del Estado español, que tiene que ver con el repunte del identitarismo en la izquierda, que a mí me preocupa bastante, me parece una especie de virus, ¿no? Y me parece que quizás el reto es cómo podemos sostener la necesidad de no patrullar las fronteras de la identidad y permitir que podamos hablar cada cual de lo que sentimos que tenemos que hablar, al mismo tiempo, escuchando al mismo tiempo las demandas históricas que yo creo que hay que situar en relación con el diálogo con el positivismo, ¿no? Que han partido de posiciones subalternas, de los feminismos, de los movimientos queer, de los movimientos racializados, acerca de la necesidad de dar cuenta de desde dónde hablamos. Me parece que la pregunta para mí sería más, ¿no?, cómo podemos sostener estas 2 demandas, ¿no? La demanda de dar cuenta en el sentido de ser conscientes, y por otra parte, me parece que Donna Haraway ya ha aportado mucho en esto, y por otra parte, cómo hacer eso sin patrullar fronteras de la identidad, que me parece una cosa terrible. Y una cuestión respecto a la biología, yo diría ya más como objeto, ¿no?, que dicen por ahí. Esto me preocupa como biólogo, y te lo pregunto también desde ahí. A mí me preocupa ser capaces de interpelar a la gente que está estudiando biología, ¿no?, y a la gente que está en esas facultades, a las que ni siquiera la antropología médica probablemente está llegando, no porque se hagan las cosas mal, sino porque la interpelación no es apropiada, ¿no? A mí, como biólogo, conmigo no van todas estas discusiones, diríamos, ¿no? Entonces, a mí de la epigenética, lo que me interesaría conocer es si nos puede ayudar a abrir concepciones muy fetichizadas en biología, como por ejemplo el ADN como una entidad cerrada, ¿vale?, de una forma que sirva realmente para construir conversaciones en las que los biólogos se tengan que poner en contacto, ¿no?, con otros agentes sociales, ¿no? Hacer algo de eso que dicen por ahí de hacer pensamiento tentacular en la biología, que es lo que cuesta, ¿no? Y si la epigenética es un gen más el ambiente, estamos perdidos. Pero yo te pregunto, igual un poco de manera optimista, te pregunto si no es ingenua esta posición, si tenemos un poco de esperanzas de que realmente en la biología se pueda hacer un poco de pensamiento tentacular en el sentido de Haraway y realmente, recuperando lo que decía Ángel Martínez, traer lo cualitativo, el valor de la investigación cualitativa a la biología, que ya implica muchas veces tener que ponerse en conversación con otra gente que no estaba llamada, ¿no? Si podemos desfronterizar la biología.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la conferencia. Yo disculparme porque he llegado tarde, pero sí que me ha parecido un debate muy interesante y bueno, tenía algo para comentar y no he querido dejar de hacerlo, ¿no? Y es sobre, bueno, el tema que se estaba discutiendo sobre el posicionamiento del investigador o investigadora. Yo un poco estos días, ¿no?, estos últimos días que todos tenemos, y ha salido también en la mesa, el Oriente Medio, ¿no?, el Middle East en la mente, y pensando en un libro de Edward Said sobre Out of Place, no me pregunto, o querría poner también en la discusión, todo el tema de la élite, del cosmopolitismo, ¿no? Hasta qué punto hay un posicionamiento o somos también muchas veces privilegiados, o hay un posicionamiento también de todo lo que hablabais del discurso decolonial o de estas figuras, bueno, formadas muchas veces en una élite, y todo este cosmopolitismo que es el que habla, tampoco habla verdaderamente, ¿no?, la voz de la persona que lo está sufriendo, que es muy interesante tenerla en cuenta, ¿no? Pero creo que también estoy un poco con Paco, lo interesante que es también ver todas las miradas y poder hablar del otro, ¿no?, desde antropología. Bueno, solo quería comentar esto para aportar algo, y gracias.
Yes, Sam, it's a very good, important question. Can you hear me, right? Yeah, cool. Yeah, look, I would say I am very split about the answer in the sense that on one side, I would agree that this is a moment, he said tentacular, we can use other metaphors for this, but definitely epigenetics, I'm sorry I couldn't show the image of the genome as a big bridge, etc., with all its biosocial related inputs and effects. It's a very, very important platform to develop really number of cross-disciplinary collaboration. This one, yeah, exactly.
Oh, no, it's not shared.
Don't worry. So on one side, I would say totally, this is an epistemic opportunity. Is a moment of where a window of opportunity is opening in terms of cross-disciplinary collaboration and possibly what you call tentacular kind of knowledge. On the other side, I feel a bit. The political economy of our universities is such that there is very little space for figures of biologists, biochemists like Joseph Needham, to mention one, right? So, of course, Needham now is an exception. He's a bit someone who cannot be easily repeated. But even people like, Richard Lewontin or Stephen Jay Gould, they were humanists and biologists at the same time. I see this very, very little around, although we are increasingly asked to go and teach to the STEM disciplines as social scientists and give our own expertise. I see very little time in early career postdocs to really read the history books about the history of science. So I really feel my hands... Well, that would be another worse expression in Italian. No, I'll give you an example of what I mean. Nutrigenomics, for instance. Excellent presentation from this rising star in nutrigenomics. In Australia, it was all about basically if you eat healthy food, you are going to be much better with your health. When I mentioned at some point exactly Galen and the 6 Galenic non-naturals and the history of food and medicine, etc., she was like... not never heard before, but with very little. So this is, again, what I see in the political economy of our university, that people are increasingly driven to very narrow, specific area. This is what is promoted, this is what is funded, and what is funded is often hyped, and this is problematic for the kind of biliteralism, biliteracy we wanted in people like Gould, in people like Needham, that was a different kind of being a humanist and a scientist at the same time. I don't see this happening much, but maybe I'm wrong, I don't know the right people. I see an increasing specialization and tendency to work, the smaller the better, not just in the life sciences though, this is true across disciplines. So it's a split answer. I think there would be opportunities. On the other side, the political economy of knowledge is such that doesn't promote this sort of polyphonic knowledge, or that was typical of certain figures who contributed so much to this kind of debates. Let's see. Okay. Blanca was more a comment, or was it a question?
It can be a question, it was a comment, but can be your opinion as you wish.
¿Ahora, Blanca?
Habla ahora.
Perdón.
Yes.
It was a comment, but can be an opinion. I mean, I would be eager to know your opinion about it.
Yeah. So exactly, sorry, just to rephrase it briefly, I sort of lost the thread of the questions here. So positionality.
Yeah. The concept of cosmopolitanism, and this elite, this idea of Edward Said about being out of place in his book, that you have different cultures, and that you are, your background, or you have brought abroad with elite schools, then the position, what happens here about your positionality as a researcher, or your position as a researcher, and I agree that which became a little bit or has no sense in somehow, no? Yes. Can we question it just to say that?
Yeah, if I understand well, I think it's very important to be what historians or STS scholars would be could call contact zones. So for me, for instance, the experience of being in Australia has been, very influential in this, in my trajectory in this sense, that I feel out of place, but in a good way, right? With the kind of skills that enable me to see things that maybe are not obvious neither to the typical white Australian indigenous kind of conversation. I sort of feel sort of outcomer, and I'm able not to see sort of, it's not about both sides. It's about seeing the complexity of what's going on there from my own specific niche. And again, I was mentioning Italy at the beginning exactly because of the confusion, which is in the history of the country, which is well epitomized in the situation with World War II, when Italy, in the space of a day, moved from being a victim to being a victor on the side of the winning. So again, it gives a sense that there are so many situations that are much more complex than the binary of settler colony versus the colonized. So I think this is an epistemic advantage, can be turned into an epistemic advantage. I hope I understood your point, Bianca.
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you. Yeah, I was stressing this idea of being of a little bit of the elite, no? But I think it's a good point.
What do you mean by elite? Sorry.
No, I mean these people that has been educated, I don't know, in for instance English colleges, or who have had certain education, who have been in different countries living, and then their position, it's not necessarily from the colonialism or decolonialism. So is it something different? No, that there is another.
I see what you mean. I think each history is very different. I mean, I represent myself, if the question was about my own position, more or less like an expat. I'm part of a major brain drain from my own country. So my feeling has always been to be more on the migrant side of things. But yeah, I see your point. I think it's a very complex, as Francisco was pointing out, cannot be simplified into white or non-white, indigenous, non-indigenous, of course.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos los que han estado aquí personalmente y online. Ha sido mucho, ¿no? Food for thought, ¿no?
I hope so.
Así que seguiremos conversando con Mauricio. Muchas gracias a todos.